They had evaded justice more times than anyone in Grayson Falls cared to count. Whenever accusations of misconduct flared up, whenever a courageous witness tried to speak out, the corrupt officers in this small city always seemed to walk free. But as they sauntered into the courthouse this morning, bright uniforms pressed and smug smiles plastered across their faces, they believed once more that they would outmaneuver the law. What they failed to see was a quiet figure standing near the back of the gallery, watching them with calm, unwavering resolve. She had gathered her evidence piece by painstaking piece, documenting every hush deal and buried case file. Today, that evidence would finally come to light, and it threatened to shatter their carefully constructed shield of power. Would real justice triumph at last? Or would these officers once again slip through the cracks they had so meticulously widened to protect themselves? Before we dive into this gripping tale, I want to welcome you all to our channel. If you're here for the first time, or if you've been here before, don't forget to drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your support helps us continue bringing you powerful stories just like this one. Grayson Falls wasn't always this way. In fact, people who grew up here can still recall when it was a close-knit place full of warmth and hospitality, a town reminiscent of the postcards you'd find in a family scrapbook. It had tidy streets, friendly neighbors, and a sense of promise permeating every block. Local merchants greeted each customer by name. Children rode their bikes to the lake without a care in the world, and folks waved at one another from their porches on Sunday evenings. Even the police were once seen as a benevolent presence, looked upon with admiration and trust. But times changed. The shift began slowly, the way a rust spot on a bridge expands from a pinpoint blemish into a gaping hole. A minor scandal here, a questionable arrest there. Murmurs of misconduct started to spread, only to vanish beneath the bustle of everyday life. Then there were the first whispers of brutality. Someone's brother got pulled over and never returned home. A local journalist's research material disappeared without a trace. Bit by bit, darkness spread across Grayson Falls. Front doors that used to remain unlocked overnight were now barricaded with deadbolts. Windows once left wide open for the summer breeze now stayed sealed behind bars. The atmosphere of trust had mutated into an ever-present, suffocating vigilance. No one wanted to believe that the police had turned into an instrument of oppression. After all, weren't these the same officers who had coached Little League and supported charity drives at the local community center? Weren't they the same faces you'd see strolling at the annual Christmas parade, tipping their hats and distributing candy canes to the kids? But once whispers turned into sobs, once hushed rumors transitioned into outraged cries, the truth about Grayson Falls law enforcement became impossible to deny. Power had corrupted them from within. The question, then, was whether anyone in town would be brave enough to fight back. Before everything took such a grim turn, there were two individuals who rose through the ranks of the Grayson Falls Police Department with lightning speed. Roderick Hayes, calm in demeanor but fierce in his ambitions, became a lieutenant at an unusually young age. He showcased the kind of leadership that instilled awe in newcomers. Hayes was articulate, always impeccably dressed, and gave stirring speeches about the honor of serving the community. If you listened to one of his motivational addresses, you might come away believing he was committed to truth and integrity. But what so many of his admirers couldn't see was how easily Hayes manipulated the system to serve his own interests. A sideways glance here, a concealed smirk there, subtle signs that he recognized exactly how to maneuver through the corridors of influence. The second figure was Trevor Wynn. Despite an outwardly relaxed attitude, he often sported a casual grin and was quick to charm almost anyone. He was, in essence, the department's enforcer. Wynn got results swiftly, albeit through methods that raised suspicions among the more conscientious officers. Over time, it became clear that whenever a suspect vanished or recanted a statement under dubious circumstances, Wynn's shadow loomed in the background. Some whispered that Wynn had connections to untraceable arms dealers, while others claimed they had seen him collecting envelopes stuffed with cash. Allegations were fleeting. No official proof ever seemed to surface. Each time a question of impropriety appeared, the reports were neatly papered over, and Wynne continued his climb unimpeded. Despite murmurs among those paying attention, Hayes and Wynne largely operated in the open. Their confidence was so immense, it was as though they were daring anyone to expose their corrupt dealings. Yet, no one stepped forward with the necessary backbone. Grayson Falls had learned the dangers of speaking out. You could lose your job, your family's safety might be threatened, and in the worst cases, you could vanish without a trace. Over time, fear paralyzed everyone, from the small diner owners to the educators in the local high school. People just kept their heads down, trusting that if it didn't stir the pot, they could scrape by with minimal disruption. But not everyone in the department followed Hayes and Wynne blindly. Officer Penelope "Penny" Barnes, who had grown up in a rough neighborhood on the far side of town, joined the force with a kind of unwavering moral compass that made her stand out. In the academy, Penny consistently placed at the top of her class in ethics evaluations and physical training alike. She believed wholeheartedly in the shining ideal of what it meant to be an officer of the law. On her first day of fieldwork, Penny was recognized for de-escalating a tense domestic dispute without resorting to force. She was heralded briefly as a rising star who could usher in a new era of community policing. That reverence only lasted until Penny began noticing how certain narcotics busts never reached the booking stage. She observed suspicious receipts that should have served as evidence but were nowhere to be found. Worst of all, she overheard phone conversations in which Hayes or Wynne would promise protection to individuals who clearly had no business holding on to firearms, let alone distributing them around town. When Penny voiced her concerns to the chain of command, those above her tried to reassure her that the department was on top of it. But after the third or fourth time she was met with a polite but menacing smile, she realized that her moral objections were unwelcome in a place so entangled in darkness. And so Penny had a choice. She could bury her ideals and join in the power games, or she could try to navigate the labyrinth of Grayson Falls corruption on her own, hoping she might piece together enough truth to make a difference. The question she wrestled with at night was this: if she stayed quiet, she might survive, but at what cost to her conscience? If she spoke up, she risked everything, from her career to her life. The burden grew heavier each day, and Penny found herself increasingly isolated. Even her closest colleagues began to distance themselves from her in fear of reprisal. Meanwhile, across town, hidden inside the seemingly tedious bureaucracy of Grayson Falls' legal infrastructure, someone else was quietly piecing together the puzzle. Her name was Alyssa North, and on paper, she was just another underpaid clerk in the District Records Bureau. Alyssa's job involved cataloging case files, cross-referencing them with court dockets, and ensuring that each piece of evidence adhered to the city's complex filing procedures. It was dull, repetitive, and guaranteed to lull others into underestimating her, which was precisely what she wanted. Because, in truth, Alyssa was an undercover special agent with the Federal Investigations Office. She had arrived in Grayson Falls with a single clear purpose: to dismantle the department's corruption from within. Alyssa's plan hinged on stealth. She knew that if she burst onto the scene brandishing her federal badge, she would never get close to the real power players. Instead, she spent months fading into the background. She wore plain blouses, styled her hair in a neat bun, and used a soft, unobtrusive voice whenever she interacted with colleagues. She offered polite smiles, but rarely initiated conversation. To most, she was just the nice young woman from out of town, the kind of person you forgot even existed as soon as she left the room. But behind this facade, she was meticulously analyzing every case that went through the city's labyrinth of legal processes. Old investigations drew Alyssa's particular focus. She compared them to recent ones, searching for patterns. Repeated names, identical witness statements, suspiciously abrupt case dismissals. She noticed that certain powerful figures, both inside the police department and among local businesses, tended to emerge from scandal smelling like roses, with the official record sanitized of any wrongdoing. Slowly, she built a mosaic of data, one that pointed unequivocally to a widespread ring of corruption controlled by a handful of local officers. Her suspicion honed in specifically on Roderick Hayes, Trevor Wynn, and a small coterie of uniformed and non-uniformed personnel who seemed to operate like a private syndicate. The stakes for Alyssa were monumental. If they discovered her identity before she could make her move, there was no telling how far they'd go to bury her. And her evidence. Men like Hayes and Wynn didn't shy away from violence, and they had the clout to make anyone vanish, even someone with federal credentials. So Alyssa maintained her invisible persona, quietly chasing digital footprints, poring over confidential memos, and strategically interviewing frightened civilians after hours. Some were so scared they could hardly speak. Others wept in relief that someone had finally come to help. But all of them feared retaliation. Alyssa carried their stories like sacred scrolls, determined to protect them by bringing down the entire conspiracy once and for all. Out in the community, tensions rose. One could sense it in everyday exchanges. The cashier at the supermarket who fell silent the moment an officer stepped inside, or the grim nods between residents after the sun sank below the horizon. The unspoken understanding was that once darkness fell, all bets were off. That was when Wynn's official patrols supposedly ramped up, but in reality, it was when his intimidation tactics were at their strongest. Storefronts were vandalized if they refused to make unmarked contributions. Journalists who tried to run exposés found their vehicles sabotaged. Fear dominated every corner, breeding hopelessness. And hopelessness, as it often does, led to complacency. Nobody dared speak if they wanted to protect their livelihoods and loved ones. Still, glimmers of courage existed. Penny Barnes's convictions refused to waver, even as her colleagues ostracized her. She spent countless nights in her cramped apartment, flipping through the departmental rulebook and local ordinances. She underlined procedures for accountability, jotted notes in the margins, and considered how to mount a legitimate challenge from within. But she was a lone officer, outranked and out-resourced. Without the backing of anyone else, she might be setting herself up to be the next person who quietly disappeared or resigned under mysterious circumstances. One evening, after a fruitless day of trying to get clarity on a suspicious arrest record, Penny collapsed onto her couch and asked herself, is it even possible to fight for justice in a place so thoroughly compromised? While Penny wrestled with her conscience, Alyssa discovered a clue so potent that her hands shook when she first came across it. Buried in a series of outdated property records was a mention of a warehouse near the outskirts of town. The building had changed owners multiple times in the past decade, each transaction more questionable than the last. Numerous official documents listed the property as unoccupied, yet city utilities indicated steady electricity usage. Alyssa suspected it was the site of large-scale criminal transactions, possibly under the direct watch of Wynn or Hayes. If she could catch them there or uncover official paperwork linking them to the location, that might be the domino needed to topple the rest. But going there herself, unannounced and alone, would be suicide if her hunch proved correct. So Alyssa waited, biding her time, hoping the perfect opportunity would arise. She continued to lead her covert existence, smiling politely at Wynn in the hallway if they happened to cross paths, or handing Hayes a file with a deferential nod whenever official forms required his sign-off. Each time, her heart pounded in her chest, but she never let her expression betray the swirl of adrenaline coursing through her veins. It was a game of cat and mouse, except the cats didn't realize the mouse had already rigged traps throughout the house. Then a name reappeared in the files, Martin Caldwell, a local security technician who'd initially cooperated with Wynn's directives. Caldwell found himself on the wrong side of the crooked officers when he refused to tamper with certain surveillance footage. According to an unfiled statement Alyssa discovered, Caldwell witnessed when accepting bribes from a known drug trafficker at that very warehouse. In exchange for his silence, Caldwell had received hush money, but guilt began eating away at him. He tried to contact someone in the federal system, and the record ended there. No further mention of whether Caldwell made the call or what might have happened afterward. Alyssa, her instincts burning, tracked down Caldwell's last known address. It was a small brick home nestled in a dilapidated neighborhood. Lines of graffiti etched across the nearby walls served as territorial markers for petty gangs. She parked discreetly, then knocked on the door. No answer. She tried again. Nothing. Through a window, she spotted furniture covered by sheets of dust, as though no one had lived there for weeks. It was possible Caldwell had fled town, or, more ominously, that he had been handled by Wynn and Hayes. Another dead end, Alyssa thought. Another piece of the puzzle locked away in silence. Her frustration ignited a new determination. She needed eyes inside the department, someone she could trust. Through hushed inquiries, she caught wind of an officer who questioned the official narrative, who had been marginalized for raising moral concerns. That was how Alyssa learned the name Penelope Barnes. Initially, Alyssa was reluctant to approach anyone on the force, knowing how infiltration works. Often the corruption runs so deep that even well-intentioned officers feel forced to comply. But desperation outweighed caution. If Penny truly opposed her crooked superiors, maybe they could join forces. Their meeting was pure happenstance, or so it appeared to anyone watching. Late in the evening, as Penny was finishing her shift, Alyssa accidentally bumped into her outside the station, dropping a stack of files that scattered across the steps. Penny bent down to help gather them, glancing at the case titles with a skeptical eye. With a disarming grin, Alyssa apologized for her clumsiness. They struck up a brief conversation, an awkward exchange about how the city's administrative backlog was insane. Penny nodded quietly, and in that moment, Alyssa sensed the latent tension in her. No one who was truly complicit in the department's wrongdoing would display that mix of exhaustion and moral ache shining in their eyes. Over the next few weeks, Alyssa orchestrated more accidental encounters. Sometimes they met at the local coffee shop near the station, other times in the lobby while waiting on an elevator. Each short conversation chipped away at Penny's guarded reserve. Eventually, Alyssa asked if she could speak with Penny off the record, away from the station. Penny froze, her expression wary, but Alyssa gently pressed. She offered just enough hints to show she knew what Penny was dealing with, that she was not alone. After a tense moment, Penny exhaled and agreed to meet for coffee after sundown, in a place where no one else from the station frequented. That night, in a dimly lit diner near a boarded-up theater, Alyssa revealed her identity. She pulled out a small badge, flipping it open just long enough for Penny to confirm that Alyssa was indeed a federal agent. Penny's eyes went wide. Her first reaction was fear. If Hayes or Wynn discovered this meeting, the repercussions would be catastrophic for both of them. But as the minutes ticked by, an undercurrent of relief surfaced. Finally, a lifeline, someone with real power to confront the injustice that had strangled this community. They spoke for hours over black coffee and stale pastries, confiding in each other. Penny outlined the departmental structure, naming names she suspected of collusion. Alyssa shared fragments of the bigger picture, implicating not only Wynn and Hayes, but also individuals in city council positions who had turned a blind eye. Near the end of their conversation, Penny looked Alyssa square in the eye. "I want these people to pay for what they've done," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But we have to be certain it'll stick. We can't let them walk out of this the way they always do." Alyssa nodded with quiet resolve. She knew exactly what Penny meant. For the plan to succeed, they needed incontestable evidence, hard proof that no fancy defense attorney could spin, no judge could bury, and no local official could dismiss. And once that evidence was revealed, they'd need to make it public in a way that these corrupt figures couldn't hush up. Meanwhile, Roderick Hayes felt an unfamiliar pang of unease. Something was off in Grayson Falls, and not just the usual simmering of resentful citizens. He noted subtle changes in the station's mood. Fewer casual jokes, more hushed conversations that ended abruptly when he entered a room. Whenever he tried to corner Penny Barnes, hoping to gauge whether she was becoming a problem, she remained polite but evasive. She had grown adept at saying nothing at all while offering a professional veneer of compliance. Hayes wondered if she was just exhausted or if she was planning something. He secretly assigned Trevor Wynn to keep an eye on her schedule, making sure her shift logs were scrutinized for anomalies. Nothing turned up so far. But Wynn had problems of his own. Rumors circulated that a ghost had been combing through old files in the District Records Bureau. First, minor inconsistencies were noted in the departmental archives. Then, redacted documents that should have been sealed turned up in departmental bulletins. Wynn prided himself on controlling the police station's flow of information. He had a few staffers on his personal payroll, but he hadn't authorized these leaks. He confronted several administrators in the records department, only to receive confusion and denial. Tension carved itself into Wynn's brow. If someone was digging, he needed to find them before they dug too deep. Neither Hayes nor Wynn suspected Alyssa North, the unassuming clerk who always smiled and avoided eye contact. That was her greatest weapon. Nobody saw her until it was too late. Amid the simmering turmoil, a single case took center stage. The case of Jackson Marlowe. Marlowe, a local mechanic with no criminal record, had been pulled over one night by an officer who matched Wynn's description. The next morning, Marlowe's wife found their family car in the driveway, but Jackson was gone. Days turned into weeks with no sign of him. Officially, the police labeled him a missing person. Unofficially, the rumor was that he had discovered something incriminating and paid the price for poking his nose into affairs that didn't concern him. The disappearance gnawed at the community's collective conscience. It was a tipping point. If even an unassuming mechanic could vanish with no answers, who was safe? Alyssa managed to retrieve the official police report on Marlowe's case, and it was littered with red flags. References to incorrect times, non-existent road closures, and contradictory witness statements. Everything pointed to a coordinated cover-up. Penny discreetly confirmed that Wynn had been patrolling that area on the night of Marlowe's disappearance. This all but confirmed that Wynn, or someone under his command, had orchestrated it. The realization crystallized Alyssa's determination. Enough was enough. That very week, she received an urgent message through an encrypted channel from her federal supervisor. They needed results. Rumors were swirling that higher-ups in the city government might catch wind of the investigation. If the operation didn't yield tangible proof soon, the feds might be forced to shut it down to protect their agent. Alyssa recognized the subtext. If she didn't move now, she might lose the chance to save Grayson Falls from total subjugation. She immediately shared the news with Penny. Their window was closing. They hashed out a plan. If they could lure Hayes and Wynn into a public misstep, something that aligned their corruption with undeniable, direct evidence, they might trigger an arrest that the entire town could witness. But they needed something dramatic and unassailable, the kind of evidence that wouldn't vanish under procedural technicalities. Then Alyssa remembered the suspicious warehouse. Perhaps they could orchestrate a sting. If they could feed Wynn misinformation, something that would make him think there was a shipment of contraband or a payoff waiting, he would show up to handle it. Penny, in the meantime, could ensure the right people were stationed nearby for backup, capturing everything on video. It was a gamble, but it might just work. Take down on multiple devices, ensuring that if one recorder malfunctioned, others would remain. But the final blow, the moment that reverberated through every soul in Grayson Falls, was when Penny read them their rights. Her voice carried conviction that came from months of suppressed anger and heartbreak. By now, additional backup had secured the area, and a crowd started to form at a safe distance. Through gaps in the milling bystanders, Penny glimpsed shocked civilians. Word had spread quickly. The city's top cops had been caught in their own nest of lies. The gravity of that fact settled over the entire scene, like a storm that had finally broken. Within hours, local and regional media descended on the warehouse. Bright camera lights replaced the pale glow of the floodlights. Disbelieving journalists stumbled over their questions. How could this happen in Grayson Falls? Who else was involved? Did the mayor know? Penny and Alyssa offered no immediate details, carefully coordinating statements with the federal team. The next morning, headlines roared. High-ranking officers in Grayson Falls arrested for corruption sting. End of an era. Community demands answers. And is there more to uncover? Still, no one was prepared for the spectacle in court. When Hayes and Wynn walked into the courthouse, there was no defiance left in their eyes. Their polished uniforms had been replaced by prison attire, and each wore a hollow expression. A swarm of protesters lined the streets outside the courthouse, chanting for punishment to fit the crimes. Inside, tension crackled as attorneys prepared for what was expected to be the trial of the century for this small city. District Attorney Javier Strong, a tall man with a careful manner of speaking, led the prosecution. He laid out the evidence methodically, connecting each piece so that even the slightest doubt shrank away. Alyssa testified under her real name, revealing her investigation in elaborate detail, her infiltration of the records department, the data she'd collected, the sworn statements from frightened residents, and the final sting operation. Penny took the stand next, describing her initial suspicions and the intimidation she'd faced at the hands of Wynn and others. Her voice trembled as she recounted cases of victims who never got closure because the very people meant to protect them were complicit in wrongdoing. The defense attorneys struggled to mount a coherent argument. They tried to paint Alyssa as a provocateur who had entrapped otherwise ethical officers. But the avalanche of evidence was too extensive. Hayes' financial records showed impossible spikes in his bank accounts. Wynn's text messages revealed instructions to cover up crimes. Multiple credible witnesses came forward, emboldened by the arrests, testifying that they had made payments to the officers in exchange for protection or silence. The trial was less a judicial proceeding and more a public exorcism, purging the city's worst demons under the stark light of truth. As the judge prepared to read the verdict, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. On one side were the families of those wronged, clutching one another's hands in white-knuckled anticipation. On the other, the last remnants of Hayes and Wynn supporters, their faces contorted with disbelief, clinging to the hope that a last-minute technicality might save their fallen idols. Neither side dared to breathe. Then, with a solemnity befitting the gravity of it all, the judge spoke, guilty on all counts. A collective exhalation swept through the room. Cheers erupted, tears flowed, and more than a few heads bowed as though a heavy weight had been lifted from the collective conscience of Grayson Falls. But the story didn't end with Hayes and Wynn's downfall. Just hours after the verdict, Penny got word that an anonymous tip implied certain influential figures in state politics may have aided the corruption by diverting federal funds. Alyssa, too, received a cryptic phone call warning that she was only scratching the surface. The voice on the other end teased that bigger players had orchestrated these events from the shadows. This revelation sent Alyssa's mind spiraling. The field of corruption was wider than she'd ever imagined. Hayes and Wynn had been formidable, but they might just be pawns in a much larger, more dangerous scheme. Yet, for the people of Grayson Falls, this day was a victory. That night, the city streets teemed with cautious celebration. Parents who had been afraid to let their children play outside after dark found a semblance of relief. Neighborhoods that had grown silent after sundown turned on their porch lights. Joyful voices gathered around news reports, analyzing every snippet of information. While a deeper threat still loomed beyond city limits, for the first time in years, it felt like the scales of justice might actually be tipping in the community's favor. Alyssa and Penny stood at the top of the courthouse steps, gazing at the surge of reporters, well-wishers, and curious onlookers. In many ways, their work was just beginning, but for one glorious moment, they allowed themselves the bittersweet recognition that, at least here, in this place that had suffered so deeply, justice had indeed broken through the iron grip of corruption. They exchanged a weary smile, an unspoken promise to keep fighting. Because some wars don't end with a single battle, and as they both knew, wherever power congregates unchecked, corruption isn't far behind. Thank you for joining us on this intense journey through betrayal, courage, and finally, vindication. If you've made it this far, don't forget to drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and tell us in the comments what you think about this incredible story. Do you believe the guilty will stay behind bars? Or is there a hidden network just waiting to pick up where Hayes and Wynn left off? Let us know your thoughts, and be sure to mention where you're watching this from. We have more stories on the horizon. some thrilling, some heartbreaking, all of them proof that truth has a way of rising no matter how deeply it's buried. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, real heroes stand up for what's right, even when no one else does.